I'm Bob Russell. I'm the Ian Barber Professor of Theology and Science here at the GCU. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. Our mission is to promote the creative mutual interaction between theology and science as an alternative to conflict or independence. The mission is 35 years old now. We're celebrating our 35th anniversary this fall. And we're becoming a part of the G2 as an internal program to give us long-term institutional stability. So this is a very good season for us. The mission is carried out through three types of programs: research, teaching, and public service. And this fellowship program really reflects and embodies all three. The research part, which is today, teaching, where our fellows will sit in on doctoral and seminary classes, and public outreach, which is here tonight. We have a public forum. It's really quite a pleasure to welcome so many of you here, and so many new folks I haven't met. I want to meet you at the break and hear more about your interest in this field and Terry's work and Ty's work. So let me just say a word about the agenda for today. You probably have a copy of that sometime with you. But we're going to have a joint presentation for about an hour. Then we'll have two respondents, then a break, then two more respondents, general discussion, and then refreshments. And just to let you know in case, there is bathrooms to the right, down the hall. And please sign up on the attendance sheet so we have your name and email address. We're doing a 3-year assessment of our program through the Temple Foundation. It would be great to have names of folks attending so we can begin to accumulate the impact we have. Also want to thank our staff. Melissa, you want to stand up? Thank you, Melissa. Brady. And somehow is around someplace. And Adrian, who has been on our board for many, many years, the founder of Counterbalance, being into the wider public discussion of science and religion, and has been generous with your time in helping to record and now move to the next stage of IT excellence. So it's a pleasure now to introduce our speakers today. It's a joint fellowship. And I'm going to use my notes because both of these folks are so distinguished that I want to be sure to at least touch on their accomplishments. So Terrence Deacon received his MA, PEM, from Harvard Grad School of Education, already showing amazing interdisciplinary approach. He worked in both philosophy and cognitive development, and that was back in '78. He got his PhD from Harvard University in biological anthropology before. He's professor of biological ecology at the anthropology department at UC Berkeley. Although he does so many things there in so many fields that it's hard to keep track, but I think Terry will tell us more about that today. He's also received numerous awards and fellowships, including the Psychiatric Neuroscience Fellow from Harvard Medical School and the J.I. Standing Prize 2005 from the School of American Research. His research combines human evolutionary biology and neuroscience. That's already widespread, with the aim of investigating the evolution of human cognition. And of course, we've all read his amazing book, Symbolic Species, in '97. His neurobiological research is focused on determining how the nature of human divergence arises from other typical primate brain anatomies. How does it arise? How does the difference arise? And what is his research also includes the study of evolutionary-like processes at many levels, their role in embryonic development, neural signal processing, language change, and social processes, and how these different processes interact and depend on each other. And his recent book, Incomplete Nature, is really the focus of our work today. And for those of you who came Thursday and haven't read it yet, have you read it by now? Yes. We have your facility. It's huge to read. In it, Terry explores the relationship between thermodynamics, self-organizing systems, evolution, and semiotic processes, and he provides a new technical conception of information that explains both its representational and normative properties. That's huge. Representational is one thing, but normative values is another. Terry has been generous in his time at G2. He has served in numerous CPS programs, and he's served on many doctoral committees, including 2 of ours today, Bookends, Adam, and Mario. Mario most recently. So it's been a wonderful experience to see this interaction, fellowship, and collegiality across the 2 campuses. Terry's a good friend. It's a privilege to have him be our joint Russell County Fellows this year. And we also introduced Tyrone Cashman. Ty received his PhD from as a Jesuit seminary at St. Louis University, and finished his PhD in philosophy of science from Columbia University. So he spans another cross-disciplinary set of fields, brings real expertise in them. In '74, he was concerned with how fossil fuel-driven industrialization was undermining the world's natural systems. He shifted his efforts to develop and provide a viable wind energy industry in America and Europe, and solar, photovoltaic, and wind energy developments in Japan. Since 2001, he's collaborated with Terry on the kind of work that has come out here in complete nature. So it's a pleasure to have Ty and Terry as our joint fellows, and I believe Ty will begin the conversation and then pass it on to Terry. Let's welcome Ty and Terry.
This is not a room in which amplification is allowed, but this is simply clarification, not amplification. I speak softly because I have a paralyzed vocal cord. Other than that, I just want to be sure that everybody can hear me. Okay, good, thanks. What I'm trying to say today, what I want to start with, rather informal, is, I don't think we need that. Yeah. I just want to talk a little bit informally about the question that we're addressing here, which is the question of the possibility of a metaphysic of incompleteness. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem in another part of the world, but in the West, we inherited a metaphysics of completeness. And we inherited it from, of course, the Greeks. And the Greeks were extremely
Fine. Put a piece of paper in front of the
great. And the Greeks were a very unusual people among the peoples of the world. And one of the things that was unusual about them is, and these are the ancient Greeks from 1000 BC to the time of Christ, they were immensely committed to intellectual accuracy and intellectual understanding of things. And they ran into a problem in trying to understand the world when they first settled down to do that. And these were the Greek-speaking peoples at the time. That goes all the way from Sicily over to Turkey. And they were all in communication, it seemed, because they were on various parts of the same issue. What they couldn't understand, they decided that it was impossible to understand, was the nature of motion. They could understand just about anything that they put their heads to, but motion stopped them. And they decided that motion was ultimately unintelligible. And not only motion in space and time, but any change, qualitative change, quantitative change, aging, embryology, none of it made any sense because it was all change, it was all motion. Now we'll talk a little bit about whether it's really true that motion is unintelligible, but I think it is. I think they were right. And so we're here today to offer the possibility of a metaphysics of incompleteness. But let me run back a little bit. Why? It all started with Parmenides. Parmenides was a thinker in Italy, actually, Greek-speaking, and he and his student Zeno really tackled the idea of motion, whether or not motion can be real. And they, of course, what they meant by real was intelligible. Why? Just because they're Greeks. Everything has to be intelligible. Now, for a Greek to be intelligible is not to violate the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of non-contradiction, as stated later by Aristotle, was a thing cannot both be and not be in the same way at the same time. And that's the fulcrum of all the intellectual world. And it goes all the way up to Russell and Whitehead in England and in America. We still live with that principle of non-contradiction. All formal systems are based on it. All mathematics is based on it. But motion didn't fit. Now, Parmenides decided, since it was so important to know what it means to be something, to be is to be exactly what you are. You can't change. If you change, then you're not really being. To be, so he linked intelligibility with being. If motion isn't intelligible, then it can't be. That was the Greek way of doing it. Now, therefore, he said, being is, non-being is not. You can't change what you are because change can't exist. Being has to be exactly what you are. And so, motion must be an illusion. Change must be an illusion. He developed a system in which all change and motion were illusions. Along came Plato. And Plato had the same understanding. But he said, we can't do nothing with the world of change, because everything that we look at is the world of change. We have to do something with it. Well, let's just take all the unchangeable things, which are pure form. Pure forms are exactly what they are and nothing else. Geometrical forms, mostly. And we'll notice that they're off in a separate realm. And then there's this other realm in which everything's changing all the time. And what will we say about its being? Well, one of the Oxford dons one time said, for Plato, the world of becoming, the world of change, almost is not. It is so tenuous hold on being. And it only has that because it reflects in a very, very imperfect way some of the pure forms. But again, you just get rid of it. Then, Plato had a student, Aristotle, as we all know, and Aristotle had paid a great deal of attention to biology. He loved observing biology. He realized that that's what makes things move. That's where movement is. He says we can't leave this out. And so he developed the first way of including motion into an intellectual structure and a metaphysic. And he ended up creating two terms, potentiality and actuality. And out of that developed the notion of substance. We have had a substance metaphysic ever since. And the substance metaphysic is essentially a completion metaphysic. It's a metaphysic of that which is complete. Now, I would say Aristotle wasn't just talking about what is complete, but what he cared about was what it was complete. If an organism has a matter and a form, when it's an embryo, it's not complete. And then finally becomes fully mature and then in action, that is what it means to be. That's really what it means to be. So we're trying to say something else, though we're really growing our roots in Aristotle. We're trying to say that it's possible to have a metaphysics that is not about completeness, but actually about being. Aristotle, with his concept of potentiality, he was able to say this. Here's how he defines motion. What moves is the movable. That is, what is potentially in motion, but not actual. And the potential progresses toward actuality. Now he's trying to define something which every other Greek before him had said was impossible to even talk about. And so he's defining an intellectual act. What moves is the movable. That is, what is potentially in motion, but not actually. And the potential progresses toward actuality. And then he nails it with the last sentence. Motion is the incomplete actualization of the movable. Aristotle let incomplete into his system. And this is why we built on Aristotle, because he knew that we had to go there. But he still cared most for, wanted most for, was pure form. The eidos, the Greek word for the pure form was eidos. And so I talk about the three eidos metaphysicians. Parmenides, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle has the eidos of Plato right down inside the moving being. But still, the eidos isn't changing inside the being, and it's not making anything happen. It's just being there. Then, a whole bunch of time went by, and about 1,000 years. And in the 13th century, actually before that with the Muslims, but in the West, 13th century, along comes St. Thomas Aquinas. And he says, where Aristotle had said to be is to be a perfect form, to be a substance, to be exactly what, where you're going, to be complete. Aquinas said, no, to be is to exist. Sure, the organism goes up from embryo to adolescence to full maturity, but that's not what it means to be. What it means to be is to exist, to have an act of existing that God has given you. Now, nobody noticed this at the time. In fact, I hadn't noticed it until yesterday. that once he had shifted being away from being complete, to be is to be complete, the old Greek's way. He shifted to be is to exist. Well, suddenly he didn't need all that completion apparatus that he maintained anyway. There was still substantial form, there was still matter, there was still potentiality and actuality, and all this great apparatus that Aristotle had created, and that Thomas just took in. But at this finally metaphysically, he didn't need it. Though he never mentioned that. So here we are, with maybe a new way of thinking about being as actual existence, instead of as full completion. This loosens the toggle switch a little bit and allows Terry Deacon to begin to offer through science a new set of understandings for metaphysics.
So out of this, there's a number of what I would call motivating questions that are behind the work that I've done. I've listed just 5 here. This is actually a little more subtle than this, but I'll try to walk through them as we go. And the first one is one that bothered me from the start. That is, why the natural sciences were so willing and so desperate to exclude teleology, purpose. Why meaning became bad news. Why purpose, why concepts of design became bad news. The primary answer, of course, is that for the most part, these are question-begging news. It says, this is a locus where it comes from, but doesn't give you any story about how it happens. Just a locus. Science wants more than a locus. They want something that we might call today a mechanism or an explanation. Now, I'm coming at this from that side of things. And what that means is that I've become interested in the problem that it's absurd to imagine that the world does not have true purpose in it. If nothing else, I have purposes. If nothing else, I represent things that are not yet true, that are possible. That in my representing them and being interested in them, I might bring them into being. A concept that Aristotle, of course, called final causality. Somehow, where a potential consequence is brought into being by the action of something in the present. Linked to this is a second piece of it, which is probably of even more relevance from a theological point of view, and that's the ontological status of the self. What does it mean to be a self? We don't have any questions about it because we assume we are, and we assume we know what that means because we are. But of course, it's also the question of the soul, of what's eternal, what's my essence, that sort of thing. In the natural sciences, in many ways, there's not any clear ontological status of the self. The self could be linked with the stuff I'm made of, maybe the energy that I'm producing, but the self that I think of as being the source of final causality, of having been here since 1950, in forms that are constantly changing. Not the same matter at all, not the same place. The sciences, I think there really isn't a clear understanding of what it means to be a self. That's part of what I want to talk about. And then, to get at this, I'm going to suggest that what we're going to have to do is something like Descartes introduced us to. And that is to recognize that there's something about the self, something about teleology, that's extensionless. It doesn't really have a simple place in space and time. It's not like matter and energy that can be located quite easily. The problem is, if I have the capacity to do anything, and if the I is myself, whatever I mean by that, this myself, the agent, how can an extensionless mode of being affect the causality of extended things in the world? This is Descartes' problem in another regard. Descartes, of course, tried to come up with a solution with a part of the brain, the pineal body. I think we have subsequently tried to do that in other ways, even in modern times, whether it's having microtubules in the nervous system being the replacement for the pineal body, where quantum events can influence the causality of the brain. But the bigger issue for us in this room is that whether we can envision a metaphysics that will be able to realign theology with science. Because one of the problems is theology is interested in final causes, is interested in the problem of value, is interested in the concept of purpose and meaning. And if they're excluded from the sciences, it shouldn't surprise us that there's constantly a friction, constantly an incompatibility that comes up again and again. My assumption is that part of this has to do with the metaphysics that we've been holding on to for about 3,000 years. And that maybe it's time to actually look back and say, okay, can we make a realignment? Is there some tweak we can do to our metaphysics, to what we assume must be the case to fix this? And then finally, of course, the question is there a spiritual path consistent with this? And as Ty said, in effect, it has to do with something having to do with incompleteness, and that's what I'll try to explain here. Is there a spiritual path not associated with perfection and completion and absoluteness, but with being in a way that is incomplete fundamentally? Is there a spiritual path associated with that? And can we integrate that with it? So those are the big questions that are going to motivate what I'm saying. There were, as I mentioned in the, let me ask this first. How many in this room were here last night?
You mean two?
No, that's 2 nights ago. It's been just vague for me. So many people were not. And so I'm not going to be able to repeat everything I said last night by a long shot. But I will do little highlights here and there. And what I will say is that the paper that I've made available to those who are critiquing it or commenting on it, I can make available to anyone that's interested. That will summarize a lot of this material. There were at the time of the Greeks, in fact, well before Aristotle, and in different parts of the world, there were alternative visions to this vision of completeness and perfection. Heraclitus is one. We normally reflect on Heraclitus in terms of his concepts about the world being in constant change. But that's not his whole story. That's the one that we've inherited in part because it's sort of the opposites. But in fact, he was just as interested in what things don't change. Although his vision of a river or a stream going by, constantly being different, is there. He had to also know that, and when I look down at some streams, I oftentimes see whirlpools that are staying in one place. The whirlpool is made up of something different every fraction of a second. But there's something that's staying in one place. There's a number of visions that he talks about in some of his fragments. One of them is depicted in A here. This is a drink from Greek, from his time. It's called the kykeon. Kykeon is made up of typically wine, but sometimes water, in which you've mixed some grated cheese and some barley groats. The problem is, if you don't keep stirring it, everything separates out. So you've got to keep stirring it, you've got to keep messing it up in order to keep it in one place, so to speak. In order to keep it all essentially together so you can drink it together. The second example is a bow, a strung bow. The strung bow has two potentials. A thong that tends to hold itself together, not be pulled apart. And a piece of wood that is stretched and wants to go back. They each have potentials in the opposite direction. But linked together, they're in balance. He recognized the importance of balance. That you can have things that are, in effect, have potentials in different directions. So that if left on their own, they'll be in continuous change. But in which, by pitting them against each other, they come into balance. On the bottom I show, of course, the lyre, by which music can be made. That is, you can use the energy that is potential in the lyre or the bow to do something that you couldn't do if that potential was not, in a sense, held there. And at the bottom right, I show something very much into the modern realm. This is one of Buckminster Fuller's tensegrity structures. A physically solid structure that is actually held together by the tension of strings pulling and solid pieces holding it out. But it's not a solid piece in that sense. It's held together by tension. So I show these because they give a sense of the way that this balance is achieved. And a lot of what I want to talk about is sort of struggling with this issue of this kind of balance of potentials. The key idea that has been my intuition into this problem is a particular, what you might call, mental or thought experiment. The difference is it's an empirically testable thought experiment. As a scientist, that's what I'm interested in, is empirically testable things. But I think it also helps us to have something that's solid we can put our fingers on, in which there's no magic to worry about. I call this autogenesis. And what I'm trying to do with this is to introduce concepts of self, agency, normativity, purpose, teleology, into the physical world, arguing that this is part of the physical world, it's not part of some unextended world of forms. To do this right, you have to essentially start where the sciences are now. Start with a kind of eliminativist point of view. Can you start with matter and energy that don't have these properties and show how those properties can emerge? That's how you would answer this. Not from a theological or philosophical position so much, but actually from an empirical position. I call this autogenesis. And I argue that it's an unambiguous proof of principle that teleological properties can emerge from components and interactions that, in isolation, exhibit none of these properties. The key is that it's an argument about what I call synergy concerns, in which two self-organized processes are preserved by a formal relationship between them. And it preserves a relationship that's not a physical or chemical relationship, but it's in fact a formal or logical relationship, which is what makes it not so easy to pin down in simple physical terms, even though it's a physical process. There's nothing that's non-physical in this process in that sense, but it's not material or energetic at least. And what I'm going to argue is that it's this relationship, a tension, so to speak, that is what provides the self-other relation that's necessary to define what life is, that's necessary to define what purpose is, that is something that is activating processes that generate something that doesn't exist yet, and that brings that into existence. And, of course, then, the self that is the agent behind this. So, this is my simple picture of two ways to put this story together. And it's an empirical story built basically upon the logic of how viruses work. A virus has a shell that falls together. It self-assembles, we say. Self-assembly is a process like how crystals form. Because the molecules have certain shapes and certain charged surfaces, they just tend to stick together in a certain pattern. Viruses don't have to tell their shells how to go together. They don't have to have an instruction set. They just have to make a lot of molecules that tend to stick together in just the right way. And that's all they do. And this is the reason viruses can be so simple and to some extent so hard to deal with. The other process that I talk about is called autocatalysis or reciprocal catalysis. A catalyst is a molecule that either brings together two other molecules, does a chemical reaction, or takes apart a molecule into other molecules without itself being directly modified in that process. It simply makes it more probable to happen, and therefore increases the probability that improbable things will happen in chemistry. This diagram is meant to capture that. This is a circle in which one catalyst, C, catalyzes another reaction. It could have gone in either direction. It takes two molecules, D and E, puts them together to make F, which is itself a catalyst that helps put two molecules, A and B, together to make C. And as a result, you can see this produces a cycle in which, over time, more and more catalysts are generated. Catalysts that generate more and more of themselves. Now, the problem is, this is a process in which these catalysts will tend to diffuse away from each other. Over time, eventually you're going to use up all the raw materials and they're going to diffuse away from each other. But if one of the side products of this reaction is to produce another molecule, G, that self-assembles or falls together into a container, or kind of a tube-like container, either one. This will tend to happen in precisely the same space and time that the catalysts are being generated. So the growth of a container will be happening where catalysts are producing rapidly. That means that container will tend to close up and capture the catalysts and not allow them to diffuse away. The result is that even though when they're captured, this process can't continue, you've now maintained the potential for it to continue. Because if the container is broken open again, then the catalyst will interact in such a way to make more catalyst, to make more containers, and to do it again. The point of this is captured this way, that the self-assembly of the capsule formation and the production of catalysts are in effect helping to maintain each other. They maintain the potential for each other to happen. But they also keep each of them from running to equilibrium. They stop the process. I liken this oftentimes to a ratchet. It says, do something, but don't slide back. Do it, but don't slide back. But if you look at it another way, each of these processes is in effect the boundary conditions, like the environment almost, for the other one. They make the conditions that make the other one possible and keep the potential for the other one from dissipating, from going away. So much so that if the system is disturbed again, broken up, it'll tend to reproduce itself, put itself back together. If it's disturbed enough to spread its parts around, it can make two that are like the first one. Make three like the first one. It's capable, in effect, of reproducing. Now, this is nothing like a living organism in that respect. It's more like a virus, but it's even simpler than a virus. It doesn't have any DNA or RNA. But it does something that viruses and organisms do at the very simplest level. What I wanted to talk about, what I wanted to use as my test case, is a model system that's so simple that we know all of the steps, in which we are not saying that there's any magic here, or I'm not even assuming that there's anything like special information or special kinds of molecules. Simple. And yet, by looking at it, we can begin to identify the beginnings of purposeful activity, of aimed activity, of self-preservational activity, of representation, of a distinction between self and non-self. All of this stuff, I think, can be dragged out of this model. The key to it is recognizing that each of these is producing a constraint. That's what these boundary conditions are. They're constraints that keep something from happening. They're preventions. But the reciprocality of those preventions creates a third prevention. And that's the prevention of these preventions being pulled apart. That is, it keeps the lower order preventions prevented from dissipating. But this is a relationship that's not exactly physical. And we'll see that because, in fact, over time, the parts can be replaced again and again and again. And yet, the only thing that's maintained from moment A with the first one, broken up, reformed, broken up, reformed, broken up, reformed, and then here at the end of that sequence, the only thing that's there that's been maintained all the way through is something that you might call its organization. Or you might say its form. That's what's been maintained. The form has been maintained despite the fact that matter and energy is not a continuity. And in fact, what that means also is if there's other molecules that might get snuck into this process, that might be dragged into it, that actually do a good job of helping out, new things can replace old things. It can evolve. That is, it can take on new kinds of catalysts that actually work better than the old ones. And because of that, it actually does something more. It can become better, more efficient at what it does, and so on and so forth. It's capable of kind of minimal evolution. Now, I want to compare it to two things. Because I'm going to compare it to, first of all, the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox, or sometimes called the Cretan liar, is begins with this story of a guy from Crete, and the assumption is everybody from Crete is a liar. And he's caught and asked whether he's from Crete or not. Well, you can tell what happens because of this, but there's a simpler way to do this, and it's the one that most of us think about. A simple sentence. This sentence is false. This sentence, if it's false, is saying that it's false. Therefore, it's true. But if it's true that this sentence is false, then it's false. But of course, if it's false, you can see we're stuck here. And this is an irresolvable sentence. That is, in absolute logic, it's neither true nor false. Or if you look at it the way I just described it, it's both true and false, depending on what stage of the interpretation you're at. The problem is you can't stop interpreting. That's the problem, because it refers to itself. Gregory Bateson and George Spencer Brown, among others who thought about this problem, said that, no, look, let's just look at the interpretive process itself. Don't try to solve it in a sort of timeless, perfect manner. It's not going to be perfect. It can't be perfect. It can't stop. It can't be completed. But if that's true, let's just think about the interpretive process. You're going from true to false, true to false, true to false, true to false. You just can't stop. Gregory Bateson says this is sort of like an electric buzzer. Now here's a diagram of an electric buzzer. I'll sort of describe it. If you don't know how it works, it's pretty simple. You've got a battery, and when the battery, if the circuit is closed, when the circuit is closed, and here this is closing the circuit, then in effect the electromagnets are turned on, and this metal bar is pulled down to the electromagnets. But as soon as it does, it disconnects the circuits, and the electromagnetic force is gone, and the spring pulls this back, which connects the circuit, which turns on the electromagnet, which pulls it down, which shuts itself off. So it oscillates from on to off to on to off to on to off, so long as there's power here. In fact, this is how the old ringers on your telephones used to be. You attach something to this bar that goes out here and taps on a bell, and it's ringing the bell constantly until you shut off the power. So it's a system that says when I'm on, turn myself off. If I'm off, turn myself on. What I want to say is, in effect, that's also what's going on in this autogenic story I just told you. Because there's spontaneous entropy increase, it's going to be eventually broken. A structure of some size, unless it's in a perfect universe, is going to eventually be broken. I liken that to the spring. That's to say, go back to the relaxed state. The more relaxed state is the increase in entropy. Break it open. However, as we noticed, as soon as it's broken open, it tends to put itself back together again. Into a state where it has broken open, it will be able to put itself back together again. It's a buzzer, in effect. Now, it's not just a buzzer, because a buzzer doesn't make itself again. But it has the same logic. It has this self-undermining logic, and that's what I want to talk about. Self-undermining logic. Because what I want to say is the autogenic story is, in many ways, analogous to life. I think of life as something that's continually undermining itself because of the second law of thermodynamics. It's in every part of its existence, in the outside world and internally as well. Things just are constantly tending to degrade. But it's also constantly going in the other direction. And it's using the second law of thermodynamics to do it. It's using the second law of thermodynamics against itself, so to speak. So, one way to look at it, let's just look at the bottom of this list. Its essential features make no sense of all of these things, including the paradoxes themselves. They make no sense until you understand that the system's disposition is to be in a different state than it is. This is precisely that problem of motion. precisely the problem of change. A tendency to be in a state that tries to destroy itself, so to speak, undermines itself spontaneously. Because of this, however, is always in existence with respect to its non-existence. It's always in existence with respect to what it's not, so to speak. And because that can't happen simultaneously in some sense, its existence, its being, is in what in classical antiquity was called being in futuro. Being across time, or Charles Peirce called that being synergistic. Continually connected. That is, you can't understand it in a moment in space and time. You can only understand it smeared in some sense. Existence, in this sense, is being in futuro. At least the kind of existence that I think you and I are. Now, there's a number of other paradoxes that I want to build before we get done here. And this is one of my favorites, in part because it leads to this grand paradox that Kurt Gödel figured out in 1931. Kurt Gödel's theorem is called the incompleteness theorem. It's not a coincidence that I called my book Incomplete Nature, and I'm talking about a metaphysics of incompleteness. Because I'm going to try to argue that I think the universe, the cosmos, and whatever else we want to put into it, deity if we wish, the nature of existence, I think, is being in futuro, being fundamentally both complete and incomplete. That, in effect, Gödel tells us that you can't have consistency and completeness. You can't have perfection and completeness. Now, what's the analogy here? This is, I think, the closest analogy to Gödel's proof, which is hard to understand. I won't try to talk you through it unless you ask me later on. This is a fairly simple paradox. And it says, okay, I've got a book with pages. And on each page there's a list of numbers. Once in a while, there are pages that have their own page number in their list. There they are. So there are pages that have their own page numbers in their list. Okay, I got it. There can also be, whoops, let me just back up a second. There are also pages like in 4. Page 4 does not have 4 in its list. There can be pages that don't contain their own page number in their list. These are two of the possibilities you have. You can either contain it or not contain it. Those are the only two possibilities here. So can you have a page that contains all of the numbers of pages in the book that include their own page number in the list? Well, yeah, you can. If the list isn't too big, if the number of pages isn't too big, the list isn't too big, but you can imagine an unendable list. You can have a huge list that can be almost as big as all the pages in the book. You can make the numbers smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, more and more. So you can make this happen. The question, can you have a page that contains all the numbers of pages, like page 4, that don't have their own page number in the list? Can you have a page like this? Well, because if it contained its own page number, then it shouldn't be in that list. It's inconsistent with the rule. But if you don't have that page number in it, it needs to be there. Because that's how you have the consistency with that list. If this is a list of all the numbers, all the page numbers in the book, that don't have their own page, that don't contain in the list their own page number. Now, the answer is here, it's not possible to do this. Why? Because it alternates. Every time you put the page number there, it shouldn't be there, you got to pull it out again. Every time you pull it out, it's supposed to go back in again. And then the same problem. Now, this is formally analogous to Gödel's proof in the following sense. Gödel found a way to map expressions in mathematics or logic onto a set of numbers. In fact, an infinite set of numbers, all primes, called Gödel numbers. And what he showed is that you have this mapping problem. Think of the list as a complicated expression. If you have a complicated expression that you can turn into a variable or a number which stands for an expression, then that expression could potentially contain its own expression. including its own negation, like in this case. What Gödel showed is something interesting, that even though Bertrand Russell tried to show at the beginning of the 20th century that I'll just exclude, I'll say you just can't do things like this, called a logical type error, because classes of things and members of things are at different levels. Let's just not let that happen. What Gödel showed is that you can't escape this. Even if you put that rule into play, you can't escape it. No system can at the same time be completely consistent and complete. So there's some analogies here. I think I didn't put it in there. A Mobius strip or a Klein bottle, I won't go into this. Mobius strip is that little strip of paper, you twist it and you tap it on, tape it onto itself. You've probably all seen Mobius strips, in which, although you can be on opposite sides, in which there's a clear boundary between what's on one side and the other side, there is no difference between the sides. So it's a kind of paradox in that sense. Because what I want to talk about is the boundary. What's the boundary of self? I'm going to argue that it's a little bit like a Mobius strip. Or the fact that for a Klein bottle, the inside is the outside, and the outside is the inside. What I want to argue is that's part of this problem of this incompleteness of self. So, again, the question I'm trying to answer down here at the bottom is two bottom questions. Go back to the autogenic story. There's something that was in the first autogen series and the last one in the series that has been maintained, although no material or energy component has been passed. What is it? Well, we might say, well, it's a pattern, it's an organization. Something persists. I'm going to argue what persists is a prevention or a constraint. What persists is keeping certain kinds of chemical reactions from happening. Something that is persistently absent across this space. And because of the circularity that I just described, the on-off, the make yourself, let yourself get broken, make yourself, let yourself get broken, it's a prevention that prevents its own elimination. A weird sort of thing. The question I want to ask here is, what's the ontological status of something like this? Because I want to claim that's the ontological status of a self. Even the simplest self that we find in an organism. Has no clear and obvious extension. It's not attached to any particular stuff. And yet it's individual. It's a continuous individual. It never disappeared in this lineage. It's a single thing. And this forces us to worry about the problems of what's the ontological status of absence itself, of prevention. What kind of thing is it? It's not a substance. And that's the challenge. This mutual interdependence of these two constraint-generating processes, their mutual interdependence is itself a constraint. It keeps that interdependence going and prevents itself, constrains itself from being dissipated. And yet, it's not stuff. It also defines what's self and other. Because the rest of the world is not it until it is. And then it's clearly part of self, part of what's going to persist into the future. But then it gives it up again. The boundary is not clear. The boundary of self here, like the Klein bottle story, is not a clear boundary. And that's because it doesn't have simple extension or simple location. I'll skip some stuff here just to get another comparison, so maybe a little more familiar. Think about a machine. A machine's usefulness is more than just the physics and the chemistry of the machine. It's not, in fact, some physical property of the machine. The usefulness of a machine has to do with the constraints that we impose on the physics and chemistry to do something we want. The machine's function is not in the machine. It's in a relationship to us, to me maybe, the designer, and my teleology. So, in one sense, the constraints, the limitations on the machine activity that keep its function going are imposed from the outside, from me. They're not intrinsic to the matter and energy. But now let's look at organisms. In an organism, the location, the locus of these constraints, as in the autogen as well, the locus of those constraints is not extrinsic. It's not outside. So as in an engineered machine, it's also not identical to its physics and chemistry. This is an interesting problem. It's like a machine. We can even talk about the parts of organisms as molecular machines. Why? Because they have a function with respect to the whole. But the function is not intrinsic to the matter and energy. It's a constraint. But in this case, it's a constraint that maintains itself by virtue of the matter and energy. Because it is any part of the substance of an organism or the autogen, it is immaterial and without clear extension. It's like Descartes' res cogitans. Nevertheless, it unequivocally exists, and it determines an unambiguous distinction between being dead and alive, inanimate and animate, insentient and sentient, matter and mind. It's like this non-extended stuff that Descartes said had to be in another realm. They can't possibly interact with matter and energy. What I want to say is, no, that division was thinking about it wrong. It ignores the absential features, as I call them, of being material and energetic. Because matter is here, and then there's space. Something is happening here, and then it's not happening. Presence and absence have to be thought about together. But this poses a challenge. The dominant substance metaphysics as the foundation of modern empirical science. But I want to be clear, it's also a challenge to a substance metaphysics that may be involved in our philosophy or in our theology. And if so, it's a challenge all the way around, and we need to make sense of it. So this is what suggests to me that we need at least to conceive of, we need to think of, as an alternative, what would it be like to have a metaphysics of incompleteness? Now, I don't have the full story for you. But I want to say that I think I posed a problem that's going to force us to think about it. It requires that our conception of being must necessarily involve perdurance, in futuro, and thus both an intrinsic relation to its own being and to its own non-being. It's a relation between being and non-being. In a sense, if you're not in relationship to your own possible non-being, I'm saying that you don't have being. It's this paradox. Intrinsically incomplete being is another way to think about it. Being with respect to what is not. But this is not only the core attribute of self coming into being, becoming, as many people have tried to call it. But it's also the very essence of all teleological relationships, including functions, as I just described, purposes, meanings, and intentions, in both senses of the word intentions, being about something as well as agency. Mental phenomena only appear to be mutually exclusive from physical phenomena because we have failed to recognize that absences actually do exist. It's not that they're non-being. They're an intrinsic aspect of being, is what I'm trying to say. This mode of being quite precisely parallels an interesting historical feature, the Buddhist notion of interdependent co-origination. It's not that all spiritual traditions have been substantialists. Buddha was actually reacting against a kind of substantialist view of, absolute being, Brahman. Saying, no, that's not it. You don't have that. This requires re-examining assumptions concerning the coherence of causality in the world, our concept of causality, and our vision of completeness of the cosmos, and I mean cosmos in the biggest possible sense. And a feature I'm not going to go into because it's going to take us far afield, even a reconsideration of the very notion of time. Notice that everything I talked about, this relation of being and non-being, each of the examples I talked about force time. If things are not self-same, not complete and perfect in themselves, time is a necessity. So I'm going to hand it over to Todd this way.
Todd, we have 5 minutes.
Okay, that should be enough.
I'll let you read it, because I got it up here, they can read it at the same time.
Yeah, that's fine. Just do it.
Certainly you're welcome to jump through this if you want.
No, I'm happy to do it. This is something that came to me actually in my own Buddhist meditation a while back, after working on this issue for a long time. The spiritual life has been called for many centuries in the West and in the East the path of perfection. We're talking about thousands of years of understanding the spiritual life. Yeah. In Buddhism, the Dhammapada is called the path of perfection. It's a little kind of the Thomas Kempis of the Buddhist tradition. The word perfection has as its etymology and as its core meaning, finished. Factus means made or done, and per means through. That which is perfect is not merely done, it is done all the way through. That is, completely. Here we have a spirituality of completeness. The spiritual path in the West has been, we believe, bedeviled by this concept. The concept finds its root in the extreme difficulty that Greek thinkers had with the changeability of motion. Motion change, as I said before, was not really intelligible. Now it is true that motion and change are not really intelligible. So the early Greek thinkers were right about that. But they were convinced in a deep way that something to be real had to be intelligible. So they came to the conclusion that only that which is exactly what it is can be real. And then I talked about Aristotle's definition that I just mentioned before, that motion is the incomplete actualization of the movable. What we are working to do, building on this insight of Aristotle's, is to understand the metaphysics of incompleteness. We're claiming that there is something essentially incomplete about this universe in which we find ourselves. Aristotle, in bringing motion into his metaphysics, was attempting to see, as a first step in an accurate assessment of the universe, how motion could be included, but never taken fully seriously. Once we open ourselves to this possibility, it's a mistake that it might be a mistake to imagine that real means to be permanent, pure, completely, even intelligible. Then we can take another look at what might be a metaphysics of impermanent, absent, changing, and paradoxical. In parallel, in the spiritual life, We have suffered from a kind of fetishism of perfection, of a kind of completion that would guarantee us an unchanging rightness of each response to any moral issue before us. A fetishism of a spiritual achievement where I would be wholly good, flawless, blameless. The root of the Gödelian universe is not static being, but emerging creativity, becoming to be what was not. We propose that just as the truth of this incomplete universe is not what it is, but what is emerging within it, so our spiritual lives consist in the doing, the practice, the going, not the arriving, and definitely not the not having arrived. In spiritual practice, this understanding frees us from the judgment of perfection, of the good as completion. The art form that is the relevant analogy to the spiritual life is dance, not sculpture. Motion, as Aristotle clarified, is essentially incomplete. So the paradox of the spiritual life is that if the real is intrinsically incomplete, what is perfection? What are we striving for? We offer for your consideration our understanding that it is only in incompleteness that the real, the good, the true, the one, and the beautiful come into being. And I think we could say a lot more about that.